When I was fresh out of architecture school, I used to listen to my uncle's stories about Papua New Guinea. He was a missionary up there. And I took it upon myself to go up and help him design and build a church. And in that time, I lived in the Southern Highlands in Papua New Guinea. And I documented 45 longhouses over a period of just under 2 years. I lived with the Kalu people. The Biami people were the last cannibals in the world, and the Foi people. And really, although I didn't know it, what I was searching for were the origins of thinking. These people were completely untouched. I was the second white person into 2 villages. When the Europeans landed in Australia, there were over 300 nations already here established with their own countries. There were over 300 language groups, all incredibly sophisticated. There was song lines and connections between country that developed relationships and understandings and respect. There was also patterns of landscape, which you can see in the middle image, that indicated why these countries were set up in terms of sustainability. When we arrived, we didn't really pay attention to those patterns. We subdivided the land in a way which was disrespectful. And today we're mining it and we're sending boatloads of dirt overseas without valuating at all. That's what's got us through the great financial crisis. I've always wondered why we have summer, winter, autumn, spring. I don't get that. I don't see leaves falling off the tree. I don't see a lot of snow everywhere. The Aboriginal people had anything from 4 to 11 seasons, depending on where they were in the country. Sydney has 6 seasons, which you can see up on the images there. And those seasons relate to animals moving through the country. They relate to flora that's flowering at a particular time. They relate to food you can and can't eat. They relate to weather patterns. And it seems to me like somewhere along the line, we've missed the boat. The image on the left-hand side is a stolen generation lady from the Kimberleys. And I saw this painting when I was in Broome, and I was quite amazed by it. I felt it sort of connected me with the place, but I couldn't understand why. The painting on the right-hand side is the wonderful Fred Williams, but the difference in these 2 paintings is really profound. One painting paints from the land through the body into the soul, and the other one paints through the eyes. One's an elevation and one's a plan. They're very different ways of seeing the place. I got in a plane to fly back to Sydney and I flew over the salt pans and I saw her painting. How did she know that painting? She'd never flown in her life. I'm worried that we follow each other. I'm worried that we follow a leader that may not be a good leader. I'm worried that we do things that maybe aren't relevant to today's world in terms of what it's been talked about today, climate change, all that sort of stuff. I actually say this is a mob of people coming out of the MCG, but it's actually sheep. And I've moved a lot of sheep in my time, but if you put a mob of sheep into a paddock, they'll walk into the wind and they might walk straight past a water source, depending on whether they can smell it or not. We need to be particularly careful at this time in our lives. The 2 biggest resources into the future aren't coal, they aren't iron ore, they're food and water. Unquestionably, clean water and good food. We've just seen an authority in New South Wales, a public authority, make a fundamental mistake about water. How can you kill 2 million native fish? What were we doing? What were we thinking? So water is a big one. The other one is food. At the moment, the only 2 industries going backwards in our country are agriculture and the arts. It came out recently in a table. The corn that you can see in this image is what's called Roundup Ready corn. It's been produced for 20 years in America. It's GM modified corn. So you can spray that corn with Roundup and you can kill all the bugs in it because it's resistant to Roundup. And then you can put it on the supermarket shelf and eat it. And we wonder, like we've got this epidemic of disease. We wonder where it comes from. I've just taken, or we, me and another professor, have just taken students to the Western Desert where we were doing a design build project. And you can see on the left-hand side to you, you can see the students communicating around a fire, cooking under the stars. I took that photograph in Jakarta the other day, 2 people talking to each other on a motorbike. When I was a kid, I learnt by playing, not playing on a screen, playing really where you could fall over and break your leg, or you could put your hand on a nest. It was a different form of learning altogether. While I was in New Guinea, a lovely lady who was the village leader down on the Fly River walked me into the forest for about an hour. As we were walking, we passed an old man carving a paddle. It turned out to be her father. As we got into the forest, she showed me this log being carved into a canoe for 20 people for her village. Her grandfather planted the rosewood tree for her to make a canoe, his grandchild. Thinking about generations ahead and thinking about generations behind. It was talked about a little bit earlier, wisdom. Where does wisdom come from? Wisdom comes from the refinement of knowledge. The Aboriginal people are incredibly good at that. That is their philosophy, that they're just here in this world to refine the knowledge from their elders down to the younger people, which is what good teaching's about. Computers don't refine knowledge, they have information, and they're really good at that. If I want information about this talk, I Google it, but I get no emotion out of a computer, and I get no mistakes, and I get no advice. We used to be creative. I went to look for a car the other day and I became extremely confused. Isn't it amazing? It's true though. I remember my father coming home from work with books of cars saying, and choose this colour, this sort of car, this shape, and it was a wonderful event. What's happened to our creativity? Where's it gone? What's it been dulled by? When the Europeans first arrived in Australia, there were very simple structures here. And they were looked at not in terms of why are they simple structures, but in terms of the structures that the Europeans were used to. These structures are incredibly appropriate in terms of climate. The top is the Cadman's Cottage. Opposite that is Cornwall Cottage in England. Then Paddington in Sydney and Paddington in London. Then a house on the North Shore of Sydney and a house in Kyoto. These buildings are almost identical. The most important thing I think about architecture is the mark that you make in the landscape or that you don't make in the landscape. And then the other thing is how the building might nurture you, how it might help you or work with your soul or give you the ability to read your soul or understand your soul. It's the most fundamental point of architecture. Connection to the landscape, because the landscape is our history, is very much part of that. And if you design a building so it can be passively heated and cool, it works incredibly well. Place, buildings for place, are really important, because if it's a building for place, it explains place. Earth, wind, air, fire and water, the elements, where are they in our buildings? Where are they in our lives? The Hakka villages in southern China were the most remarkable buildings, 360 people per building in the world. Those people have moved out of those buildings into the buildings on the right. What's the social and psychological implications of that? We were given that brick building on the left-hand side to change, and Belinda Koopman and myself decided to put a big veranda and a ventilator on the roof, and the change has been radical. This problem is not just an Australian problem, this is a worldwide problem. This is Brazil, where my partner Fernanda and her wonderful sister Flavia have created the opportunity for us to work in a favela there. This is where we're working, an old kindergarten, and we've taken students over for 3 years. We've put 3 additions on the kindergarten, a veranda, a water room where you can catch water, which isn't done, a ventilating kitchen and a sunscreen. We've worked with the people really closely. We've taught them how to filter water because that wasn't part of their language. And we've built structures that are appropriate to that culture, to a tropical culture. We've introduced hygienic conditions to the favela. We've got a water room and the students stay with the people. They're getting an education that is just rare, impossible to get. And we've produced a building now which is innocent and simple, but has become the centre of the favela. For 20 years, Lindsay Johnson set up, 20 years ago, this non-for-profit organisation which teaches about this stuff. The teachers are Britt Anderson, Glenn Murkett, Uncle Max Dulamumun, Aboriginal elder, you and Aboriginal elder Richard Paxley and myself. We've had over 2,000 architects from 80 different countries who believe these values. How do we translate this into a building today? I think it's really simple. We transplant that longhouse, the values of the longhouse, the origins of the longhouse. We make a building that's recyclable, low embodied energy, sustainable, can be dismantled, passively heated and cooled, not a big footprint, and yet it's got to have beauty and it's got to have serenity in order to be architecture. Thank you very much.